Most people imagine the Industrial Revolution as a story of factories, steam engines, machines, smoke rising above crowded cities. And in a way, that story is true. But the real transformation of the 19th century didn't happen inside factories. It happened between cities. In the early 1800s, distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in time, risk, and uncertainty. A farmer could harvest grain in abundance, yet still struggle to sell it. A city might face hunger, while food existed hundreds of miles away. Moving goods was painfully slow. A shipment of wheat might take weeks to arrive. Wagons broke down. Roads turned into mud. Rivers helped, but only where they flowed. And storms, bandits, or simple bad luck could erase an entire journey. So most markets lived and died in isolation. Each town was its own small economic world. Prices rose and fell locally. Surpluses stayed trapped where they were produced, and shortages remained where they appeared. For centuries, geography controlled the limits of trade. Then something new appeared across the landscape. Long lines of iron stretching over fields, forests, and mountains. Steel rails. At first, they looked like simple infrastructure, a faster way to move cargo, a new machine for an industrial age. But the railways were something far more powerful. They were the beginning of a new kind of economy, an economy where distance mattered less. Markets began to merge, and entire continents slowly started behaving like a single system. But to understand why railways changed everything, we first need to understand the world that existed before them. When people think about the Industrial Revolution, they usually picture factories, rows of machines, workers moving between gears and belts, smoke rising from tall brick chimneys. It's the image that appears in textbooks and documentaries alike. But that picture only tells part of the story, because the real transformation of the 19th century did not happen inside factories. It happened between the cities that those factories served. Production was only one side of the economic equation. The other side was movement, how goods traveled, how information spread, how markets connected to each other. For most of human history, these connections were slow and fragile. A region could produce enormous wealth, yet remain economically isolated simply because transportation was too difficult. Railways changed that reality. For the first time in history, goods could move across vast distances with predictable speed, not just occasionally, but every day on fixed schedules across expanding networks of track. And when transportation becomes predictable, something powerful begins to happen. Markets start to synchronize. Prices in distant cities begin to move together. Supply can reach demand faster. And entire regions that once operated separately start behaving like parts of a single economic system. In other words, railways didn't just move cargo. They connected economies. But to understand how revolutionary that connection was, we first need to look at the world before the rails existed. Before railways, economies were local by necessity. Most people lived, worked, and traded within a very small radius. A town might be only a few days away from another town. Yet economically, they could feel like separate worlds. The reason was simple. Moving goods across land was painfully difficult. A wagon pulled by horses could only carry limited weight. Roads were rough, uneven, and often turned into deep mud after rain. A journey of a few hundred miles could take weeks, sometimes longer, and every mile increased the cost. Transportation often cost more than the goods themselves. A farmer might produce a large harvest, but selling it far away could be impossible because the journey would erase any profit. This created strange and painful contradictions. One region might suffer famine, while grain rotted in another. Food existed, demand existed, but the system connecting them was too weak. Rivers helped, but only partially. They allowed large shipments to move cheaply, yet rivers flowed in one direction. Goods could travel easily downstream, but returning upstream was slow and expensive, and many regions had no rivers at all. So for most of human history, geography decided the limits of the economy. Mountains, rivers, and distance shaped where cities grew, where industries formed, and where trade could happen. In other words, geography was destiny. But this geographic prison created a massive economic problem, and solving that problem would eventually change the structure of entire civilizations. At first glance, the problem seemed obvious. Distance. Cities were far apart, and transportation was slow. But distance alone was not the real issue. The deeper problem was fragmentation. Markets existed, but they were disconnected from one another. Each town operated inside its own economic bubble, with its own prices, its own shortages, and its own surpluses. Information traveled slowly. Goods moved even slower, so supply and demand could not properly meet. A harvest failure in one region could send food prices soaring. Meanwhile, another region might be producing more grain than it could possibly consume. In theory, trade should solve that imbalance. In reality, the system linking those regions was too weak. By the time grain arrived, the crisis might already be over, or the shipment might never arrive at all. This created enormous price differences between cities. The same product could cost 3 or 4 times more in one region than another, simply because moving it there was too slow or too expensive. And those price gaps revealed something important. Economies were not limited by how much they could produce. They were limited by how efficiently they could move things. Logistics, not productivity, had become the real bottleneck of economic growth. And once people began to understand this, a new idea started to emerge, an idea that would change how entire economies were organized. The breakthrough did not begin with economics. It began with engineering. In the early 19th century, a new form of transportation started spreading across parts of Britain. Iron tracks laid across the land, steam engines pulling heavy wagons. At first, these railways were built for very simple purposes, moving coal from mines. But the technology revealed something powerful. Trains could move faster than horses. They could carry far more cargo. And most importantly, they could do it on a fixed path, on a reliable schedule, with far fewer interruptions. For the first time, transportation became predictable. A shipment that once took weeks could now arrive in days. Merchants could plan around arrival times. Factories could depend on steady deliveries. Markets could begin to operate with confidence instead of guesswork. But speed alone was not the real revolution. The true breakthrough was the network. As more tracks were built, railways began connecting cities, ports, farms, and industrial centers into a single system. Instead of isolated towns struggling with their own supply problems, regions became linked together like nodes in a vast economic web. Goods could move across that web continuously. And once that system began expanding, something remarkable started to happen. Entire continents slowly began to function like unified markets. And nowhere did this transformation become more visible than in one rapidly growing nation. Nowhere did the railway revolution unfold more dramatically than in the United States. In the early 19th century, the country was enormous but economically fragmented. Cities along the Atlantic coast were connected to global trade, but the vast interior remained isolated. Travel across the continent was slow and uncertain. Farmers in the Midwest could produce huge quantities of wheat and corn, yet reaching distant markets was a constant struggle. Wagons moved slowly. River routes were limited. Entire regions remained economically cut off from the rest of the country. Then the railways arrived. Year by year, steel tracks pushed westward across the landscape, first linking nearby cities, then crossing rivers, plains, and mountain ranges. Frontier towns that once felt remote suddenly found themselves connected to the national economy. Grain grown in the fertile fields of the Midwest could now reach the crowded cities of the Atlantic coast. In return, manufactured goods from eastern factories flowed back across the rails to supply expanding western settlements. The exchange moved constantly. Food eastward, tools and machinery westward, people moving in both directions. And as these connections multiplied, something remarkable began to happen. Prices across distant regions slowly began to converge. Markets that once operated independently started moving together. A continent that once functioned as scattered local economies was beginning to behave like a single national market. But the railway system did not stop at national integration. Because once the model proved successful, the logic of the railway economy began spreading across the world. Once railways proved profitable, expansion accelerated with remarkable speed. What began as a handful of regional lines quickly turned into vast national networks. Investors saw opportunity, governments saw power, and engineers saw the chance to reshape geography itself. Across Europe, tracks began linking industrial cities to ports and coal fields. In Russia, railways stretched across immense distances, connecting remote regions to the imperial center. In India, rail lines spread across the subcontinent, binding together cities that had once been separated by weeks of travel. The pattern repeated everywhere. Steel rails pushing outward, networks growing denser, markets becoming larger. But the railways did far more than move cargo. They forced societies to reorganize around time. Before railways, every town kept its own local clock based on the position of the sun. Noon in one city might be several minutes different from noon in another. For centuries, this difference hardly mattered. Railways made it impossible. Train schedules demanded precision. Networks required coordination. And so countries began standardizing time itself. Suddenly, infrastructure was no longer just about transportation. It was about coordination. Railways synchronized cities, industries, and markets into one continuous system. They reshaped how governments planned infrastructure, how businesses organized supply chains, and how economies function at scale. In short, railways were no longer transportation projects. They had become the backbone of modern economic organization. And that same logic still shapes the infrastructure of our world today. Today, railways rarely dominate discussions about the global economy. When people think about modern trade, they imagine cargo ships crossing oceans, planes carrying high-value goods, or data traveling instantly through the internet. But beneath all of these technologies lies the same basic idea that railways introduced in the 19th century. Networks, systems that compress distance and allow markets to function across enormous geographic space. Container shipping lanes now connect ports across entire oceans, moving vast quantities of goods with remarkable efficiency. A factory in East Asia can supply stores in Europe or North America because those maritime routes operate like the railways of the sea. At the same time, fiber optic cables carry information between continents at the speed of light. Prices update instantly. Orders travel across the world in seconds. Financial markets react in real time. And behind the scenes, enormous logistics networks coordinate warehouses, trucks, ports, and distribution centers. These systems move goods continuously, linking producers and consumers across continents. In many ways, they are simply the modern version of the railway economy. Different technologies, but the same underlying principle. Build the right network, and isolated markets begin to merge into a single system. And once that system forms, something deeper begins to happen inside the economy itself. What railways truly created was something economists call market integration. At first, the concept sounds technical, but the idea is simple. When transportation becomes fast, reliable, and predictable, distance begins to lose its power over the economy. Goods can move easily between regions. Information travels faster, and markets that once operated separately begin to influence one another. One of the first signs of this change appears in prices. Before railways, the same product could cost dramatically different amounts in different cities. Grain might be cheap in one region and extremely expensive in another, simply because moving it was too slow or costly. But as rail networks expanded, those price gaps began to shrink. Prices started moving together across distance. And when that happens, something deeper begins to unfold. Regions start specializing. Farmers focus on crops their land grows best. Industrial cities concentrate on manufacturing. Ports become gateways for global trade. Each region becomes a part of a larger system. The economy stops behaving like scattered local markets. Instead, it begins functioning like a single organism, with goods, capital, and information constantly flowing through its networks. And once an economy reaches that level of integration, its growth potential changes completely. Because infrastructure doesn't just move goods. It reshapes how civilizations organize themselves. By the end of the 19th century, the railway had done something extraordinary. It had redrawn the economic geography of entire continents. Cities that once stood quietly along rivers or crossroads suddenly became major industrial centers simply because railway lines converged there. Junctions turned into hubs. Small towns transformed into powerful commercial cities. Where the tracks went, growth followed. Industries formed around these new transport corridors. Factories could receive raw materials faster. Farmers could reach distant markets. Merchants could move goods across regions with unprecedented reliability. The entire structure of the economy began to reorganize itself around the rail network. Local markets slowly gave way to national ones. prices began moving together across vast territories. Production became more specialized. Trade expanded at a scale never before possible. In many ways, the railway economy did something civilization had never achieved before. It connected entire continents into single economic systems. Because railways were never just about trains. They were about connection, the birth of interconnected markets that would shape the modern world. The story of railways is really a story about infrastructure, because when a new network connects markets at scale, the entire economy begins to transform, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. Railways did it in the 19th century. Other systems are doing it today. And if history teaches us anything, it's this: the next great economic revolution usually begins quietly long before most people notice it. If you enjoy exploring the hidden systems that shape our world, subscribe and join us for the next story.